Hello and welcome to a very losing episode of Pittsburgh Sports Memories. I'm your co-host Steve Wirt, and as usual, I'm joined by not a loser.
I am winner Tim Hannon.
Yeah, he's winning, much like Charlie Sheen or whoever else. On this episode, we're going to cover it's kind of a dark episode of our of Penguins history here. There was a losing streak they had in Philadelphia from 1974 to 1989. So they actually, believe it or not, Tim, they did not win in Philadelphia for 15 years in
That's
hockey.
really hard to believe.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not like you just play like one game there a year. They played a couple games there every year. So
Yes, that's not good,
yeah.
especially against that team.
Yeah, so this is obviously the Philadelphia Flyers and the Penguins. And it's kind of a tale of two teams. So both teams, if you know hockey history, the NHL was founded, and for a long time it was just the original six. Can you name the original six, Tim? I don't know if I can. Oh, it's Rangers, Red
R-
Wings,
Yeah,
Blackhawks,
Maple Leafs,
Canadians.
Canadians, and Bruins.
Yeah. So it was just, believe it or not, that was it. That was all the hockey teams you had until 1967. And at that point, they decided to expand. And can you name the next six teams that came into the league with? And I'll give you the Penguins, obviously the
Yeah, and the
Penguins.
and the, and the Flyers, uh,
Okay.
the Blues,
Yep.
the Oakland Seals,
Oh man, you got the hard one.
um, the oh man, Capitals. No, that was a few years later. Oh, I can't name the other ones.
Man, I can't believe you got the Seals because I thought for sure you wouldn't get the Seals. Now it's the Kings and the North Stars.
Oh wow,
Remember the Kings' old uniforms? They were like ridiculously looking back
they
then.
were like they were
Yeah.
purple, weren't they?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was weird. So the Kings and the North Stars and the Seals are not the Kings, North Stars, Blues, Flyers, Penguins. Believe it or not, all of those teams have won Stanley Cups. And obviously the Seals went moved to Cleveland and became defunct. They are no longer existing, so they never won a Stanley Cup, so they never can win a Stanley Cup unless Cleveland decides to get a hockey team. But
And then I'm
I
sure they won't win anything because it's Cleveland.
well, maybe they can put LeBron on ice skates and they'll be really happy. So I'll start with the Flyers. The Flyers definitely came out of the gate and have a lot more success early in their history than the Penguins did for a long time. In the early 70s, which we'll start with there. They are dubbed the Broad Street Bullies because they always played at the Spectrum, and the Spectrum was on Broad Street in Philadelphia, I guess. Yeah, and their star players, they had a goalie named Bernie Parent, and he actually won a Vezina trophy, but he had to share it with Phil Esposito, who I believe played for the Blackhawks. And they ended up winning back-to-back Stanley Cups in 73 and 74 and 74 and 75. And they were well attended. Like even this game that I'm going to talk about, they were getting 17,000 people in the Spectrum. So they were selling out the Spectrum, and the Penguins were definitely not selling out the arena back then. By contrast, the team on the other side of this state had a rough start. They had poor attendance. They really weren't making the playoffs. So, their players in this game in 74, when the losing streak starts, was called the Century Line. And they had a guy named Seal Epps who played center, and he had 85 points in that season in 74. He had a guy named Lowell McDowell. He was a left wing, and he led the team in goals. I Pronovost. I can't ever pronounce
Yeah,
his name.
John Promenos. Yeah,
Pronovost. He was the right wing, and they had 72 points. And they were called the Century Line because I guess they had scored 100 points cumulatively.
Clever.
Yeah. Um. So what's going on in the world of 1974? Well, besides both Tim and I not existing, um, does anybody remember gas shortages and rationing? Because Richard Nixon and OPEC and oil people. A guy named Milton Shapp. No, remember he was governor back then. He was actually from Cleveland, and he somehow decided to became governor in Pennsylvania. He had been a businessman, and I know my dad didn't like him very much because I guess during this time there was big trucker strikes because they were trying to put. I guess they were capping their wages or something with the price controls were killing the independent trucker. So my dad at that point was driving from Harrisburg to Philadelphia a lot on the turnpike. And he told me a story about like the truckers would at one point block the turnpike. Like they parked all their trucks in the middle of the turnpike.
Oh
And
my.
so you couldn't get through. And of course, my dad, being fresh out of Vietnam, was not intimidated by that. And like people would, like he said, a trucker tried to run him off the road. And my dad, being who he is, pointed his firearm at him, and the trucker thought better of it.
Oh boy. Well, 1974, different time than today, huh?
Well, I mean, this dude had like, he's literally 4 years review. He just like was
Sure.
literally getting shot at and shelled by the Viet Cong. He's not going to be intimidated by some idiot trucker on the turnpike. Good
Yeah.
luck, you know.
Yeah. Good point.
He's not your average citizen. so, so the 70s were wild. Like, and Milton Shapp was apparently not the greatest governor in the world. So what was going on in the hockey world was, like we talked about, the Flyers are really good, and they're kind of a, how could I say, they play a physical brand of hockey. Tim, is that what we would call it?
Yeah, if I mean that's like, if somebody goes out and, assaults somebody on the street and takes their wallet and leaves them for dead, and you say, well, that was pretty physical, you know, guy there.
And like, I don't know. I talked about Bobby Clark. He was one of their star players, and he had actually won a Masterson Trophy, which I guess is for hockey excellence in hockey or sticking with it. And Bobby Clark in 1974 was most famous for doing what in 1972. The Canadians played the Russians, who had back then it was the Cold War, so the Russians had this really great hockey team, but none of the players would ever play in the NHL because of Cold War stuff. And so there's this guy Valery Kolarov who was like absolutely, the Canadians couldn't stop him. So Bobby Clark did what all good goons do. He slashed and broke his ankle. So that was the end of Valery Kolarov for the Summit Series in '72. So that kind of gives you a picture of who Bobby Clark is. But he was a good hockey player. He could score goals. He wasn't just a goon. He was like, that was kind of like the Flyers. They would definitely fight you, and they were tough, but they had talented players too. Another guy was a guy named Dave Schultz who played, and his nickname was, and is a great nickname for a hockey player, the Hammer. And believe it or not, he had a career penalty minutes of 2,292, and he still holds the NHL record of 472 penalty minutes in a year. So,
Wow. Yeah, and I wonder, this is pre Wayne Gretzky.
yes,
So
yeah,
so hockey probably, and if you figure like if Gordie Howe is kind of like the greatest player of that pre-Gretzky era, and Gordie Howe was a guy that got into a lot of fights and took a lot of penalties. I don't know that you had a lot of athletic types. You know what I mean? Playing this game, it was probably just a really tough game. I mean, the NFL was kind of like that, probably around the same time to a degree, right? You just had to be kind of made of a lot of toughness, and that carried you a long way. You didn't have the necessarily the kind of the gifted athletes maybe you would have years later.
yeah, for sure. And two, you got to remember, like there was a lot of restrictions on teams on players you could draft. That's why the Canadians were like amazing, because I think it was a rule, and I don't know for how long this was a rule. You could not draft players that were from Canada, like in the first
Uh,
round, like something insane like that. Like they had to be drafted by Canadian teams or like original six teams. What a ridiculous rule. So, you wonder, I guess eventually they got rid of that rule because obviously Bobby Clark and Dave Schultz are Canadians and Pronovost and but I
Right.
think at least in the expansion draft, they weren't allowed to take Canadian players, which is
Hmm.
just insane.
Interesting.
Yeah, sounds like a great deal to. No wonder Montreal built Montreal just like had Montreal was the best team of this decade when they win 5, 6 Stanley Cups in the
Yeah.
70s. And I think this is still the era of was that the 80s where like remember before the game the Flyers that was in a Stanley Cup final, wasn't it? Where the Flyers and the Canadians got in a fight before the game even started. It's
Yeah,
like
that sounds on brand.
yeah, it's insane. So yeah, that happened. So before this, on January 20th, 1974, the Penguins actually win 5-3 in Philadelphia, and John Pronovost scores in the win at the Spectrum. So January 20th, 1974. That would be the last time the Penguins would win for a long time. And what had happened before? Now on February 7th, this is actually when the losing streak starts. Um, the day before the February 7th game, intern general manager Jack Burton fires head coach Ken Schenkel in what Jack Burton called a unilateral decision. And he was actually replaced by a gentleman named Mark Bollier. And I apologize if I'm butchering the names here. And Mark Bollier actually was fired in 1976 in that season after going 15-23. He did last a couple years. And Ken Schenkel, just the circle of coaches, was actually coach again for the Penguins after Mark Bollier in 1977. So they went back to Ken Schenkel. Actually, Ken Schenkel ends up sticking with the Penguins for a very long time in their front office. So I think
Hmm.
he was more of a front office guy than kind of like a Craig Patrick.
Yeah, the Penguins were known to do that for a lot of years. Kind of, yeah, they wouldn't necessarily like fire somebody. I mean, or they would, but then they would sort of recycle them back to some degree.
Yeah. And actually Ken Schenkel had some success. And the Pens made the playoffs and lost to the Maple Leafs in the late 70s. And then he went back to the front office, of course, in 84 and oversaw some of the drafting of Mario and such. Um, so obviously February 7th, 1974, a date that will live in infamy. It's actually a back and forth game. Fred Shiro is the coach of the Flyers at that point. There are 17,000 fans in Philadelphia for this game, for a regular season game in February. So that's pretty impressive. The paper actually said that Dave Schultz, who's called the Hammer, the guy with all the penalty minutes, said he stopped bullying long enough to score 2 goals. Bobby Clark scores a goal. That's of course after he's done slashing people. It was 6 minutes left in the third period. Terry Cripps scores the game-winning goal for Philadelphia, and believe it or not, McDonald and Pronovost both scored goals for the Penguins. I do believe it was the final score. It was like 5-4. The Flyers had 51 penalty minutes to the Penguins 19, but the Penguins only had 3 power plays. So I'm not quite sure how that works.
Math doesn't check out there.
But that's according to NHL.com. So I don't know.
Was
You
it like
could,
a 5-on-0 power play?
I don't know. But there was a lot of fighting going on. So, so literally from that point on, the Penguins do not win. And Tim, that's hard to believe. And obviously, we weren't around for this game. And I just remember growing up, like my dad was a much bigger hockey fan than he was pro football, and he liked college football. But I would say hockey was probably his second, well, behind baseball. But he would like always talk about, wow, I can't believe they can't win in Philadelphia, and it was just like kind of became like a running joke like in the 80s. So obviously in 1984, the Penguins get some guy named Mario Lemieux. And even in 84, like from 84 to 89, they still cannot win. There's a couple ties in there, but they do not win in Philadelphia. So
Yeah,
finally, yeah, I mean, any
that's just
comments, Tim,
that
there?
that's just so hard to believe. To your point earlier about this isn't, this isn't like a team that you play. Like the Steelers have a long streak of not winning in Philadelphia also, but they don't play the Eagles in Philadelphia very often. It's once every maybe
So often.
7 or 8 years.
Yeah.
And here you have two teams in the same division playing each other often. And it's just a hockey game. Like hockey games go, there's 82 of them in a season,
And I
you
think
know.
they were both, I think at times, but I think in the 80s they were in the Patrick division. Now, before that, I'm not sure what division they were in.
Because the Penguins were in the Norris division for a while, so maybe
Yeah.
that's why. But still,
But
they
then even in the 80s, they were in the, like you said, they were in the
right.
Pat, and it was years they did not win
Yeah. Yeah,
Philadelphia.
and you said there was ties, so that means that there were several times where they were in overtime. They just needed one goal
Yeah.
and they couldn't get that. That's yeah, it's really stunning to this day that it went on that long.
So, and it actually went, believe it or not, to February 2nd, 1989. So, just to, update this, the Penguins, they finally break the streak, and the Flyers players the coach was Paul Holmgren. I don't remember that guy at all. I do remember this guy, Tim Kerr. Do you remember Tim Kerr?
Yeah, I remember Tim Kerr.
He just like kind of stand in front of the net and nobody could move. So,
Yep.
another guy we remember more, maybe more finally, was Rick Tocchet. He was another big standing tough guy standing in front of the net. Like the Flyers had the same team they always had. And I think the Flyers at that point were still in their streak of making the playoffs 18 years, 18 seasons in a row. So the Flyers like were a very successful team. I mean, they're not like terrible now, but they've kind of sunk into mediocrity, but they were a very good team. Um, he was a Penguin killer too. Rick Tocchet scored some goals against the Penguins. It was kind of another one of those. Well, if we sign him on our team, he can't score against
Yeah.
us, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and they were a good team. They had been to the Stanley Cup Finals twice. I want to say 85 and
Yeah,
87
they
against
just had lost to Edmonton,
right.
which it's like the god of that.
Right. And I think even in the one series that they lost, they even had the Conn Smythe winner, uh, their goaltender, who you're probably going to talk about at some point. So they even played a pretty good series against Edmonton, but they just weren't the Edmonton
Yeah,
Oilers.
Ron Hextall.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I was just about to mention he was one of the. He actually Ron Hextall was the first goalie to actually score a goal. Now they credit Billy Smith, but it's like an own goal by the other team. Remember the rule in the NHL used to be like if you scored an own goal, it would be credited to the last offensive player to touch it or something like that.
Oh, so somebody scored an own goal, but Billy Smith was the last guy to touch the
Yeah,
puck. So he didn't actually shoot the puck into the
right.
net.
Ron Hextall was the first guy to actually like there was an obviously an open net and he shot
Right.
it. Remember Fleury? Has Fleury done that? Like he always tries it, but he's so bad at handling the puck he can never
No,
hit it.
Jari did it.
Yeah,
Jari was the only Penguin
goalie to ever do it.
goalie to ever do it. I don't know if Fleury ever did it with another team, but I know he never did it with the Penguins.
He would always try it. Like when there's an empty
Yeah,
net, you knew he was gonna. He's so bad, like what to score a goal.
yeah,
Um. So Ron Hextall obviously was general manager for a couple of years. Didn't work out the greatest. He's actually from Pittsburgh. He's from Green Tree, believe it or not. And yeah, poor Ron. He has kind of a things go a little differently for the playoffs in '89 for him, but we'll talk about that a little later in the aftermath section. Now another goalie who's another interesting, and this is the weird Pittsburgh Philadelphia tie here, is Ken Reggett played on this
mm.
'89 team, and Ken Reggett was pretty good, and he actually ended up playing for the Penguins, and he ended up help relieving Ron Hextall in that playoff series that we'll talk about later. But it also Shell Samuels. I didn't realize Shell Samuelson. That guy was just like 8 feet tall. He was like Zdeno Chara before Zdeno Chara.
Yeah,
He
when the
was just like
Penguins,
like what the heck? Like the Flyers basically put a football team on ice. Is pretty or like
yeah, yeah. And when the Penguins made that trade for Tocchet, they also got
Shell.
Samuelson and
Yeah.
Reggett.
Yeah.
That was all part of the same deal.
So for the Penguins players, do you remember Coach Gene Ubriaco?
I do remember Gene Ubriaco.
He coached for like what, a year and a half, maybe?
Yeah,
Uh,
I remember
he was
the,
pretty terrible.
the yeah, there were two coaches, the Pens had. Pierre Kramer was the guy
Yeah,
before him,
before Ubriaco.
and
Yeah.
Ubriaco, and I just remember Mario didn't get along with either of them, and that was really what did them both in, was that Mario just didn't like them.
It happens. Happens to the best of us, I guess. So obviously, like we talk about, Mario's a legend. He's doing all kinds of great things, but the Penguins have not made the playoffs at this point since, well, yeah, since 1981. As of this season and as of this point, they have not made the playoffs, which is like they have the best one. I mean, you could maybe argue him or Gretzky, but they have the second best or the best player in the sport, and they can't even make the playoffs. Which, making the playoffs in hockey is like back then. How many teams missed the playoffs? Like two, right?
There were 21 teams and
Eight.
16 made the
Yeah,
playoffs, so five. You had to be one of the five worst teams in the league
yeah,
to not make the playoffs. And like you said, Steve, to do that with a once in a generation talent like Mario, you really have to try hard to make the rest of the team bad. And remember, that was the era where you had all these teams getting into the playoffs, like the Minnesota North Stars that one year were like 12 games under 500, but they
yeah,
were in the playoffs because they were a little better than the team, behind
yeah,
them was, I don't know, 16 games under 500.
yeah,
That's all
yeah.
you had to do was just be a little bit better than the really bad teams, and we couldn't do it.
And you got to remember, they did have Barrasso at this point, who's a Vesna winner, and they had Wendell Young as his backup, and they had Peter Angelo. So I mean, it's kind of weird, and that they couldn't even make the playoffs. And Rob Brown, another joke about the playoffs, my dad used to say was like, just wear a white carnation and you get in. And
Pretty much.
yeah, Rob Brown, obviously a Penguin legend. He scored a lot of goals. Had a great goalie celebration, as we'll talk about later. Talk about Wendell Young. He another connection to Philadelphia. He actually played for the Flyers the year before, believe it or not.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he actually ends up playing this game, and I remember that the February 2nd game because what's his name? Barrasso was hurt, had been out for a couple games, and another guy you might recognize, Dave Hannon, and your
Great name.
brother. He was like, 10 years old, was playing hockey and was a veteran presence on the team. Then he was just coincidentally named the
Well,
same.
and we loved that when we were kids, my brother and I, because he also spelled his name the same way we did, which is with a Hannan. And a lot of times when you see that name, it's spelled
Owen.
Hannon,
Yeah.
which seems more logical, right? Like,
Hand on.
well, Shannon, that you spell that with an O, Cannon, right? Any word that rhymes with that, you would put an O instead of an A. It's not Hanan, but that's the way that our name is spelled. And so it was cool to see not only a Pittsburgh team with that, but see like that name on the back of a jersey spelled the same way. I just remember we thought that was pretty cool when we were kids.
Was he what he was like a winger or something, wasn't he? He was
Hmm.
he was like more of a defensive player, if I remember
Yeah,
correctly. Yeah.
he wasn't spectacular, but he had a cool name.
Yeah. So, this is like I said, this has become a thing. The Penguins can't win in the Spectrum or in Philadelphia or against the Flyers. So they kind of need to get this monkey off the back so they can make it back to the playoffs and have some success in the playoffs, you would think. So that all kind of comes to a head February 2nd. And actually before the game, there's a radio station in Pittsburgh called WDVE, and they've Are they still? I don't know. Does anybody listen to radio anymore? Or we all listen to Spotify now, or I don't know. I think people still listen to radio,
I'm
right?
sure they do. I mainly listen to podcasts, but but
Okay, too.
but I do. I just that's what I listen to all the time. I just download a bunch of podcasts. So
Well, back then, Tim, there was a radio DJs named Paulson and Kren, Scott Paulson and Jim
yeah,
Kren, and they're like that was always tradition. Like DV, that station always was kind of the top station in Pittsburgh, and they were the top DJs at the time. And they actually, do you remember this, Tim? They dressed up as witch doctors and went out on a spectrum of ice before the game and like performed like a witch doctor ceremony to like cast out the jinxes of Ghost of Spectrum Past.
I do remember Scott Paulson and Jim Cran, and I did listen to them for years and years. I do not remember this though. That's
Yeah,
pretty
it's
funny.
yeah, they went out there and like, oh, it was pretty funny. So
It
hopefully, I mean,
worked.
I don't know, I can't say that definitively broke the curse, but hey, I'll take whatever I
Didn't
can get.
hurt.
Yeah. So, like I said, Groundhog Day, 1989. It is not Groundhog Day. Bill Murray wakes up and it's not Sonny and Cher on the radio. The Pens win. They win on a strong performance by Rob Brown and Wendell Young. Lemieux actually has 7 shots, but he didn't score any goals. And can you guess? Remember the score in 1974 was 5-3. Can you guess what the score in February 2nd, 1989 was?
I'm guessing it was 5-3.
It was 5-3. And what had changed in those years? Well, I think the fall of communism. There's no more Berlin Wall, I guess, at that point, or maybe that summer it was coming up, thus launching the career of David Hasselhoff. Hextall was, of course, the losing goaltender. And the Flyers really cleaned up their act. Remember how they had 51 penalty minutes in 1974? Well, they only had 48 in this
Oh,
game.
well, that's and what? Only 2 power plays this time?
No, there were 6 power plays, but the Penguins only went 1 for 6 on the power play. And I'm sure
Okay.
every Pens fan in the building was yelling, "Shoot the puck," as they were passing it around the perimeter. John Cullen was a big player on this team. This is before the trade, of course. And, they had a decent team. It was kind of like shocking that they didn't make the playoffs earlier than this. So they win, and I remember watching this game because I remember they would sell tapes of the game, like VHS tapes. Is any you?
What, like after the game was over or after the
No,
season was over?
like at the end of the game, like KBL, because this was definitely on the KBL channel, which was the old cable network that the Penguins used to be on. They would be like, "Oh, if you want a tape of today's game, send a check to, PO box whatever, and
Oh
we'll send
wow.
you a tape
I
of the
don't
game."
remember that. So like if you didn't have a
Yeah,
VCR, you could go buy the tape. Well, I guess you need the VCR to play the tape, but
yeah, you could get like a professionally made version of that.
oh,
Yeah,
okay. Cool. I did not remember
I
that.
guess they owned the rights completely. The
Yeah,
NHL, well, knowing the NHL, they probably weren't smart enough to negotiate those rights.
that's true.
So, so thank goodness at long last our local regional nightmare is over and we finally beaten the Flyers in Philadelphia. Thank God, huh, Tim?
Yep. Yeah, and that was around the time. I mean, people do you think that was the biggest rivalry at that time? I mean, I think it
For the
probably
Penguins,
was. For the
probably.
Penguins, yeah.
Well, maybe the Rangers, maybe.
Yeah,
But that was more later when Adam, what's his name, Graves
Graves, yeah.
slash Mario.
Yeah, and the Capitals hadn't really become a rival yet. I mean, at that point people really hated the Flyers. And I think it was pretty mutual. I don't think it was like a Penn State Pitt thing where, we hated the Flyers and the Flyers were like, who's Pittsburgh? I think it was pretty mutual. Um, and carried obviously forward for the next 40 years as well.
He waits. He throws the pass, and it's intercepted. John Polamalu at the 40, 35, 30.
Steelers versus Ravens is the best rivalry in all of pro sports. And now that series has been chronicled in Pittsburgh versus Baltimore, the unofficial history, an all-new book from the Pittsburgh Sports Memories podcast. Relive all the fierce battles and exciting moments from this amazing rivalry. There were legendary plays like Troy Polamalu's pick six and the immaculate extension, and there were crazy incidents like Joey Porter chasing Ray Lewis into the parking lot, or the Ravens putting a bounty on Hines Ward. We cover all of it, including some stories you may never have heard. Buy a copy for yourself, or get one as a gift for the Steelers fan in your life. Find it on Amazon, or see the link in the show description of this episode. And thanks for supporting the podcast.
So, the Penguins, like I said, we'll have to do a whole podcast on this. That they go to the playoffs. They actually make the playoffs for the first time since 1981 and that season, 1989. And they sweep the Rangers in the first round. And then in the second round, like you said, because we're in the Patrick division, we have to play the Flyers. And they lose to the Flyers in a wild 7-game series. If you remember, the Penguins totally owned Ron Hextall that series until they changed to Ken Reggett, and Ken Reggett was able to kind of stabilize the ship and made a lot of great saves and really probably won the series for the Flyers. And also, that was Mario's first playoff appearance. The highlight, probably one of the highlights, was there was a game where the Penguins scored 7 goals on Ron Hextall, and Robbie Brown would do that windmill. And Ron Hextall chased Robbie Brown around the ice because he wanted to fight him because he's a Philadelphia Flyer, and that's what they do. But the Flyers ended up getting the last laugh where they, and I think there's an empty netter at the end of that series at Game 7, which I do believe was in Philadelphia.
Yeah.
But the last Game 7 was in Philadelphia, and the turning point, like you said, was at Game 6 here. Probably winning, Game 7 in a building that you haven't won a lot. The game they needed to win was Game 6.
Right.
And they lost it 6-2. So.
Right. Yeah, and that was just the irony of that's the season they finally broke the curse, and then the season ends
in the Spectrum.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we'll go over that. We'll have to do a whole podcast on that season, because that's obviously a pivotal season in Penguins history. So just like I said, the 42 game winless streak at the Spectrum, it went from February 7th to February 2nd, February 7th, 74, February 2nd, 1989. The Penguins were 0-39-3 at the Spectrum. From 1967 to 1983, Philadelphia went from 1967 to 1989, Philadelphia went 86, 36, and 19 against Pittsburgh.
Wow.
You remember ties, Tim, weren't they great? But the fact that not only did they lose 39 times, they only even tied 3. You would think maybe you get a few more ties in there at least, but
yeah, that hurt. My experience was a little different than yours as a kid. Your dad was into hockey. My dad wasn't. He was baseball and football. And so I didn't get into hockey really until Mario came along. And then even then it was a few seasons into Mario's career. And kids at my school started playing hockey, and I had a Mario poster in my room. So that's when it was around this time that I was just starting to dip my feet into being a hockey fan. So I kind of came around to the end of that. But even then, I knew the pain of how long that streak was, because they talked about it all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. I mean, every time there was a game in Philly, it was okay, is this finally going to be the game? And then it wouldn't be. So I don't know that you'll ever see something like that again, where it goes on that long.
It definitely okay. Now the last game in the Spectrum was 1996. Surprisingly, Tim, it was a loss, 4-1. John LeClaire scored a goal. What is up with all the Penguin Flyer connections, huh?
Yeah.
Ron Hextall, believe it or not, was the winning goalie in 1996. So
wow.
I guess he got the last laugh again. Out of the original 6 teams do you? This is an easy question. Who out of those teams, besides obviously Oakland/Cleveland, never winning a Stanley Cup, do you know who has the most Stanley Cups out of the teams that came in 1967?
Well, let's see. We have 5. Philly has 2. LA, I think, has 2.
Maybe 3. No, they have 2. The back-to-backs. That's it, huh?
Uh, uh, St. Louis has 1. Who was the other?
Minnesota.
Minnesota has 1. No, yeah,
2.
1.
I thought they haven't won one in Dallas, or no?
Yeah, they did win 1 in Dallas.
And that's it. Okay. Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
Is
So
that everybody?
it's Pittsburgh. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a weird, like, I noticed this. It's a weird, like, switch that happens. Like, the Flyers were the model, not, I mean, besides the way they played, but that's just how they play. They were the more successful, let me say this, model franchise in the expansions from, the 70s all the way to the mid 90s. They were the team that won the 2 Stanley Cups. They were the team that didn't have these ridiculous losing streaks. And then, when Mario comes around, and it takes him a few years, and then in the 90s and the 2000s, it kind of flips to where the Penguins are the successful team and the Flyers are kind of stuck in mediocrity. And thus, the old Mark Madden line, have you ever seen the Flyers win the cup? Because actually, I don't think the Flyers have won a cup in my lifetime, and not in yours, Tim, right? 75, yeah. So we've been spared that, indignity, I guess. Or
Yeah, I've actually asked my brother to have that printed on my tombstone.
Have you ever seen the Flyers win the cup?
Well, just like Tim Hannon died whatever year, the Flyers never won a Stanley Cup during his lifetime.
I'm okay with that, huh?
I think it would be a great way to troll Philadelphia fans. But yeah, you're right. It's been that many years, and that's a really good point. Like this 1989, them winning at the Spectrum really did flip everything, and it flipped not only the path of those 2 franchises, but you could also argue that it kind of flipped the style of hockey because the Flyers continued for years, and they did have some moderate success. I mean, it wasn't like they stunk after this.
I think they made the conference finals and lost to us. Did they make a Stanley Cup finals since? I think they have.
Yeah, they lost one in the 90s to Detroit. They lost in 2010 to Chicago.
Yeah.
So I mean, it wasn't like they stunk, but they continued, Bobby Clark became their general manager. And then for years and years, they tried to replicate the 70s. Like you said, guys that weren't just goons. They had skill. They could score goals, but they were goons. And that's the kind of team. They've kind of gotten away from that the last couple of years. But
they don't have a goalie. That's been their Achilles heel for years, is they don't really have a goalie. Like Hextall was good, but Pelle Lindbergh, who we didn't talk much about, died in a car accident, and that was probably their most promising. Bernie Parent was, I don't know a ton of Flyers history, but I would say Bernie Parent's probably their best goalie ever, right? I mean, he's the one they won the cups with, And Hextall would probably be a close 2, They had Ray Emery. Remember they had Ray Emery? Didn't they make a run with Ray Emery one year?
Yeah.
I mean, the late Ray Emery. So
I mean, they getting rid of Sergei Bobrovsky was probably their biggest mistake.
But he was like that guy for Washington, Jim Carrey, not the actor, who like the Penguins just chased him out of the league. And I think for whatever reason, the Penguins, there are just certain goalies the Penguins own, and Bobrovsky is one of them. So
yeah, but I think they would have done better,
Well, yeah.
He won 2 Vezina trophies and a Stanley Cup. Ended up being a pretty good goalie. So that was obviously a mistake. But yeah, they tried to play with that style of hockey, and then the Penguins,
go the other way.
Era of finesse, the athletic, speed, scoring, all that kind of stuff. And it wasn't like the Penguins. It wasn't like the whole league flipped because the Penguins started playing that way in 1989. I mean, I would say the Oilers obviously probably started that trend long before the Penguins did. But still, that really does it is, like you said, Steve, a line in the sand. of where things just completely flipped. And you're right. Ever since then, the Penguins have won 5 Stanley Cups since that day in 1989, and the Flyers have won. Wait, hang on. Let me just check my notes again. 0.
Well, as far as Pittsburgh sports, I think we kind of mentioned some of these all-time streaks in Pittsburgh sports of like ineptitude. The Pirates losing streak of 20 years. We did a whole podcast on that if you want to relive that misery. I would say Pitt not beating Miami football much, although they are 3-7 in the last 10 matchups, and 2 of those wins were in Miami. And like you mentioned, the Steelers have not won in Philadelphia since 1965. And Bobby Lane was not the quarterback in that game. I looked it up because I was bored. But I mean, and that was literally in 1965. That was one of the Steelers' 2 wins that season. So, but that's like you said, like they don't play although it seems like they've played Philadelphia more regularly lately. It's not like they play them every year. It's not like it would be like if the Steelers started losing, like how Cleveland lost to us for years and years, how Ben had a winning record in Cleveland, better than their own quarterbacks. It would be kind of akin to that, I think.
Yeah, and Cleveland had that losing streak at Three River Stadium for 16 years. That you're right. It's probably more comparable to that. The Steelers and Eagles, the way the NFL scheduling works is you play the AFC, you play an NFC team once every 4 years.
Is that still a thing now with the 17-game schedule? See, I wasn't sure if
that's what I was just going to say. So it's still a thing. So we only play the Eagles every 4 years, and you would play them
home and home.
Home and home. So you really only play at their stadium once every 8 years. But when they added that 17th game, now every year you play one team from a select division that finished in the same spot as you did. So if the Steelers and Eagles both finished in, say, second place, and the NFC East and the AFC North are playing each other next year for that 17th game, then they would play each other. And that's why you've seen the Steelers play at Philadelphia more than once in the last 8 years because of that kind of stuff. But other than that, it still has to take a lot for that to work out that way. So you're right. It's not akin to that. It is more akin to like Cleveland not winning here for 16 years because it was every year they played here. And then even that's not a good comparison because it wasn't just that the Penguins played one game a year in Philly, right?
I don't know how many they played, but I would guess 3, 4 a year.
Yeah.
I mean, because you normally play like what? I mean, I don't know. The schedule in the NHL has always been a little goofy, but I would guess that on average they probably played 5 to 6 games every year against the Flyers.
Yeah, and the NFL is a you have every game is you have a 17-game season. Every game is meaningful. Hockey, it's like you win and lose games all the time, right?
Yeah.
You could be playing this last place team in March and they could easily win because it's just a long season and stuff happens. And you played back-to-back nights on the road and you had one of your guys
You
hurt.
Wendell Young playing goaltender that night because your other
Yeah, so I mean just to lose that many games in a row is just that's a real level of ineptitude that you like I said, you'll probably never see again. And
hopefully not.
Hopefully not.
Yeah, at least not for the Penguins. I mean, and to have the best player at the same time, like that was the craziest thing was like they had Mary. That's how bad the Penguins were managed. I mean, I think Esposito, I think was their GM there during little run.
Yeah.
And so they really didn't have success until Craig Patrick came in and kind of cleaned things up. And that's when the things started to change for that team's fortune. So, like I said, 1989 was a pivotal year in Penguins hockey, and we'll definitely have to do a deep dive on that. Just want to say thanks for tuning in. This podcast doesn't have any losing streaks, does it, Tim?
Never.
Never.
They're all winners.
They're all winners. All right. Well, thanks for listening, and thanks for checking in on the Facebook pages and our website at PittsburghSportsMemoriesWeekly.com and the whole 9 yards. We appreciate your listenership. Check out the book, the Ravens Steelers book, when you get a chance. It makes a great gift and great reading. People really enjoy it. Leave a comment, tell your friends, and thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.